Yeah, a lot to cover today. So, hi everyone, welcome and welcome back to Cafe Oleh. My name is Jay. Here at Cafe Oleh with Nefesh B'Nefesh, we go over the everyday Hebrew you need here in Israel to succeed. Whether that's reading and paying your bills, going grocery shopping and reading nutritional labels, reading the news, striking up a conversation, flirting, dating, job interviewing, complaining, all the everyday things you do in your native language and in your country of origin, but here in Israel in modern Hebrew. As always, we'd love to hear from you what topics you'd like us to cover. You can always email us at hebrew@nbn.org.il. That's hebrew at nbn.org.il. You can also see all of our previous lessons up on YouTube. Just go to youtube.com, type in Cafe Oleh. The very first entry should be a link to our playlist. There's now over 150 videos there, 24,000 plus views. You can certainly leave us a note there. Not to mention subscribe to our channel there. If you're joining us live on Zoom, you can write to us with any questions, comments, concerns in the chat. Excuse me, which we'll review after class. If you have any questions regarding the topic we're about to cover, you can write that in the Q&A. Although we have a lot to cover today, so I highly recommend writing anything to us either in the chat or more importantly, following up with us by email. At the top of the hour, I'm going to answer any questions that we have time for and talk to you about Wednesday's class, our Cafe Oleh conversation class, which we highly encourage all of you to join. Whether you've joined us in the past or not, we offer the opportunity to practice the Hebrew we learn here at Cafe Oleh together in a safe, unrecorded, off-the-record environment with people at your own level. We have levels from absolute beginners to advanced, so you are welcome at any level to join us. I'll talk more about what we're going to do on Wednesday's class at the top of the hour, as well as next week's topics. With that, let's get started. So today's class is going to be a little different in that we're going to do something a little bit more grammar-based, grammatical, if you will. And we've talked about it in the past, but we haven't necessarily put it together in the way we're going to do tonight. And the best way to think about this class without being too over the top or melodramatic is if you've seen the movie The Matrix, that's this topic. Why do I say that? Because if you saw The Matrix, at least when it first came out, it messed with your minds. It was hard to digest. But once you understood it, and certainly the characters in the film, you could not see what they were talking about, and everything was framed as in that film. What we're going to do today is understand Hebrew in its most basic form, which will allow you from the most beginner level to the most advanced level, understand nearly every word you'll ever encounter in the Hebrew language, whether you've learned it or not. And we're going to talk about sort of the meta aspect, why you don't learn like this, why it should be learned like this, perhaps, and how to create your own new words. The point of today's class is how to recognize and create new words. There's going to be a little bit of spreadsheets and there's going to be some PowerPoint. Bear with me. Why are we doing all this week? First off, I think this is a really important class, and I'm going to explain a little bit why in a second. But also, as I explained last week, this week celebrates Yom HaIvrit. Yom HaIvrit, the international or the annual day of Hebrew language, is celebrated on the birthday of Eliezer ben Yehuda. Eliezer ben Yehuda is considered the father of modern Hebrew. Um, we know that he was one of many pioneers, but he was very much the face of creating Hebrew into an everyday language after centuries of being used only in religious contexts and only in terms of basic words between Jewish communities that could understand each other so that they could create trade and foster connections. Eliezer ben Yehuda and colleagues created modern Hebrew. And one of the ways they had to create modern Hebrew was understand how not only Hebrew works and Hebrew grammar works, but the absolute nucleus of the language, which is how are new words created? How are words, period, created? Old words, new words, words that have been around for 5,000 years or some 5 days ago. Right? And so what we're going to look at today is how are words created in Hebrew. I'm going to frame it in the sense of new words, but it's really about how are all words in Hebrew created. When I say words, also I'm talking about the building blocks, nouns, adjectives, and verbs. Follow along. I promise this is going to be, I hope this is going to be as revolutionary for you in thinking how the Hebrew language works as possible and how to learn it. And if not, like I said, it's the Matrix. Watch it a couple times. Watch our class on YouTube. Hopefully it'll kick in and click. With that, let's get started. So, first things first. View. View slideshow. How to recognize and create new words in Hebrew. Okay, we're first going to do, these are both interconnected, right? Because it's not just about how do I read Hebrew when I'm just learning the language, or what do I do when I see a word that I've never seen before and I freak out. But it's not just about comprehension, it's also about empowerment, right? When we're learning a language, it's also about how do we actually take charge of the language we're learning and feel some empowerment by using it. So why is this so important? Why am I spending all this time on this? Why will I continue to spend time on this? First off, a very important aspect. For those who think spatially and or math friendly, modern Hebrew is a game changer in languages and language acquisition. For those of you, I'm going to speak to, especially those of you whose English is not their first language. How hard was it to learn English? For those of you who English is your native language, how many years did you spend in primary and secondary school literally repeating lists of irregular verbs and learning how to spell and all sorts of things that didn't make sense outside of just rote repetition and memory? Hebrew doesn't work like that. Hebrew has rules, and just like science and things like that, has rules that you can repeat and that will give the same results, right? That has to do with, that's logic. And that's also why it's so math friendly. But it's also spatially, and I'm going to explain that as you see as we talk about how words are created in Hebrew, and how you can create your own. Okay. Logical and predictable than certain European languages, also creating words. That's also has to do with spelling. We've talked about spelling before. We have previous lessons on that. We're going to talk a little bit about that tonight. But equally important is the subject of Hebrew itself and how it's taught, right? How and why we learn Hebrew is still at odds with everyday life in Israel. And that's why here at Cafe Oleh, we emphasize we're talking about everyday Hebrew in Israel, right? Modern Hebrew is related to, yet different from religious Hebrew. Although many of us on this call may come from religious backgrounds or observant backgrounds, there are some people on this call who aren't even Jewish. But for those of us who are, what we're learning today is adjacent to the Hebrew we learned in a day school or in a yeshiva or Hebrew school or university even, okay? Meaning it doesn't have a religious context. It has a religious context in so much as the language is used in celebrating religion in the state of Israel. But modern Hebrew also has to do with everyday things that if you're learning Hebrew in a religious context, you don't have to deal with. You don't need to know the words for elements. You don't need to know how to read a nutritional label. You don't need to know how to understand a traffic report. None of those things are contained in religious Hebrew, adjacent because they're the same language and some of them even have the same words, but because they don't have a religious context, we often don't learn these things. And so when we come to Israel and we all of a sudden hear Hebrew and it's amazing, everything's in Hebrew, but we feel lost because it's not the quote unquote Hebrew we learned. And that goes into our next part. Hebrew teachers in diaspora are not always well versed in contemporary Israeli culture, nor trained in how to teach it. I emphasize a lot on contemporary Israeli culture because I personally think it's amazing how we've resurrected an entire infrastructure of a society and we draw on the past and we create our own things and they all intertwine. That's amazing to me. I know that doesn't, get everyone else enthralled. And I know that because I know how you learn Hebrew and how you don't learn Hebrew. I personally learned Hebrew from a very young age. I remember specifically going into day school from Hebrew school, and the book that we used was a book used for ulpanim for Russian immigrants and former Soviet Union Jews. So they were using words that had to do with industry and engineering and the theater that a seventh grader in suburban Washington, D.C. has nothing to do with. It literally had Russian script in the book, right? It doesn't have to do with Israeli culture. And I know many of you are still using Hebrew books, with all due respect to formal Hebrew education in this country, that are 20, 30 years old. They're not using contemporary culture. They're not using slang or song or trends of any kind. Okay. And equally important, formal education hasn't always caught up with Western audiences being the primary pool, of current and future leaders, and thus their pedagogies. How we learn a language in North America or Western Europe or elsewhere in the world is different than how we learn languages in other countries. How I learned modern standard Arabic in the United States is profoundly different than how it's taught in the state of Israel for obvious and various reasons. Okay, so too here, if you have learned a language, Spanish, French, German in the United States, for example, that is often a very different way than you're learning Hebrew in the state of Israel. Similar goals, but different methods. Okay, this all explains why what I'm about to teach you is so important to understand the basics of Hebrew, which is this. Hebrew, modern Hebrew, even ancient Hebrew, but especially modern Hebrew, is a lot like seventh grade algebra. X times Y equals XY. If you want to do X plus Y equals Y, please don't come at me in the comments. You do you. I'm explaining it as X times Y. That's my explanation. X times Y equals XY, right? Where we plug in the various numbers into these factors and we get a sum. X is our shoresh. Every Hebrew word, noun, verb, adjective, has a shoresh. Shoresh in Hebrew on the left-hand side literally means a root, R-O-O-T, like a plant in the ground. Okay? Vast majority of these roots are 3 letters. Some are 2, some are 4. The vast majority are 3 letters. That root has a meaning, right? It has a general meaning combined with a form. In Hebrew, tavnit, a mold, M-O-L-D, not mold as in grows on your walls because it's winter in Israel, but mold as in a jello mold, right? Or a baking mold. In this case, why? Okay. Form is either called a binyan, if we're talking about verbs, or a mishkal, if we're talking about nouns and adjectives. Not to mention everything else that goes with it. Person, is it first person, second person, third person? Is it tense? Is it gender? Is it all those different things? Is it plural? Is it singular? All those different things, right? The shoresh, that 3 letters, is the nucleus. We combine it with the form, and that produces, on the right-hand side, a word, or in Hebrew, milah. Every single noun, verb, and adjective in modern Hebrew is comprised of these 2 things, a root and a form, root and form. Every single word, therefore, can be reverse engineered. You can deconstruct it and put it back together and understand it because both of those things are predictable and both of those things, the root and the form, have their own meanings. And that's how we create a word. We combine 2 meanings together to create a word. General meanings to create a specific thing, i.e. a word. That's it. That's the summation of modern Hebrew in one slide in some simple algebra. If you want to make it even more simpler as addition, go for it. But that's it. Every single word has 2 components, a root and a form. No more, no less. Let's look at an example. Let's look at 2 examples, in fact. Okay. If we take the root, shoresh, kaf, taf, bet. Okay, kaf, tav, bet. Kaf, tav, bet has the general meaning in the Hebrew language of something to do with writing. It's not definite, right? Because it's not yet a word. It's only a shoresh. It has the general meaning of the word, of the general idea of writing. And then we plug it into a form, and that form has its own meaning. In the case of verb at the top, okay, if we look at the top one, the verb, we have what we call binyan pa'al, and we'll go through this in a little bit. But basically, verbs come in 7 different forms. One of them is called pa'al. It's the most basic form of the verbs, okay? And we turn that into an infinitive, which has its own form, and we combine all that together, and we get the word lichtov. Lichtov means to write. Once you understand the rules of forms, binyanim in this case for verbs, all you would have to do is look at this word with or even without the dots and bars that indicate vowel sounds and predict how to pronounce it and what it means. That's what I'm talking about, Hebrew being so logical, because it's so predictable. I can look at this word even without the dots here, but even with the dots, especially with the dots, and I know because how the forms work in Hebrew, I pronounce that lichtov, and I know because of the general meaning of the word, of the root, kaf tav bet, and this form, it has something to do with writing. This verb means to write. Okay, that is a predictable thing that even if I didn't know all of that, but I knew its specific, its particular parts, its separate parts, I could guess that and I would be about 90% correct. That's how predictable Hebrew is. Let's look at another one. Kaf, taf, bet are same root that has a general meaning of writing. And now we're going to turn it into a noun. Okay, Mishkal is what we use for nouns and adjectives, as opposed to binyanim. There are 7 binyanim in modern Hebrew. In modern Hebrew, there are dozens and dozens of mishkalim. That's the plural. In fact, there are so many of them, you only learn a few if you're learning Hebrew in the state of Israel as a native Hebrew speaker for the matriculation exams called Baguliyot. You will almost never learn this learning Hebrew as a second language. Never, almost never. And you certainly won't learn this until a very, very advanced level. Whereas I think this makes Hebrew a lot easier to understand because it's all just a bunch of patterns and predictable repeating patterns. Okay. In this case, the Mishkal is called Miktal. Okay. As opposed to the Binyan, which was Pa'al, this one is called Miktal. Miktal usually has to do with some sort of, it's an object. It's usually some sort of tool or device. In this case, Miktal, Yachid, it's a singular one. If we put this all together, we get the word Michtav. Okay? Without knowing the word, what Michtav means, I know it has something to do with writing. And because it's in the form Miktal, and it's singular, right? It's Michtav, not Michtavim, which is another way of understanding it. I know that this word is something to do with something that is written, i.e. a letter, Letter, like a letter you write to someone. Okay. 2 words broken apart into their basic components, understood, put together. All Hebrew words, nouns, adjectives, and verbs follow this pattern. Root times form equals word. Or if you want, root plus form equals word. Whatever the mathematical operation you want, you do you. I'm picking multiplying. Every word. Verbs, nouns, and adjectives alike. Okay. Along with this comes a very important point before we get to looking at verbs. Actually, let's do that first. So to understand how the verb part works, because the verb one you're going to learn, and it's important to learn because it's how you will conjugate verbs in the future. Let me just stop sharing that. Share. Here we go. We're going to come back to this as well in a little bit. I want to show this first, just as a basic review of how Hebrew verbs work. First off, let's start at the bottom, what I talked about binyan, right? There are 7 binyanim in modern Hebrew. Sometimes a shoresh, a noun, can fit all 7. Sometimes they can't. The meaning doesn't work. There are various reasons, right? For example, we're going to take the same root we just looked at, taf, taf, bet, that has something to do with writing. If I plug it into one of the binyanim, the first one, pa'al, that we just saw, it means to write. In this case, katav. The way this works is that the name of the binyan corresponds to how we conjugate this verb in the past tense, third person singular, i.e., he does something. So if I want to say he wrote, I take that root, kaf taf bet, I I plug in that vowel pattern, like pa'al. I do katav, he wrote. You now understand every verb that's ever been created in the Hebrew language. Okay? Katav is part of binyan pa'al, and I know that because of that same vowel pattern. He wrote. Pa'al has the meaning of the most basic form of the meaning of that amplifies the basic meaning of the root. So for example, we know this root has to do with writing. So if it's in pa'al, it also means the most basic form of that root, he wrote. If I plug it into nif'al, I know that it means nichtav, first off conjugated to be nichtav, nif'al, and it means it was written. Okay, the passive form of the basic. The next two are not used specifically for this verb, but it's one of the most popular binyanim. We're going to come back to this one when we create new verbs, which is pl, pl-e-e. So in this context, kitev, he addressed. We don't really use this verb in modern Hebrew. It exists, but we don't use it. And we're going to talk about that also in a little bit, why certain words exist but are not used. Same thing in other languages, by the way. If we plug it into another form, hif'il, hif'il, hichtiv, following the same verbal pattern, vowel pattern, right? Hif'il, hichtiv. We just plug in our root into this form. Hichtiv. Hichtiv means he dictated. It is the causative form of the verb, of the root. And to cause someone to write means to dictate, right? I dictated to him to write down for me the following things, right? It also has a passive form, huchtav, huf'al, huchtav. It was dictated. And finally, hitpa'el, hitpa'el, hitkatev. Okay, same vowel pattern, hitkatev, hitpa'el. This one is reflexive or reciprocal or got or became in English in meaning, i.e. he corresponded. He wrote to one another. Two people wrote to one another. Reciprocal, hitkatev. Okay, that's how Hebrew works. 7 binyanim, you're going to learn verbs. Some of them have roots that can apply to many of these. Some only apply to one. Okay, but the form, the binyan has meaning, not just the root that you're learning. Okay, and up here, and I promise you'll get the sheet along with the spreadsheet, the PowerPoint, excuse me, you have all the different parts of speech when it comes to verb conjugation. Infinitive, past, present, future, imperative, gerund, past, conditional, subjunctive. We've done this before, but I wanted to put this all together in one lesson. Okay, how you conjugate a verb. Once we figure out it's binyan, now we have to conjugate it, right? And that's what all this at the top is. Okay, let's go back to our PowerPoint. Excuse me. Slideshow. We've talked about this before. We're going to keep talking about this again. In Hebrew, you can't mess up spelling. And we just went over why, but I'm going to emphasize it even more now. I kept saying kaf taf bet, right? For the shoresh of our previous one, right? Kaf taf bet. That order of letters has its own meaning. Okay? That order as well as those specific letters. I can plug in different things as part of the form to create a word, but they have to be in that sequence. You cannot swap one letter for the other. You cannot swap a similar sounding letter for another. In Hebrew, spelling is destiny. Just as I wrote here, all words are created from a combination of the root and a form, making correct spelling crucial for understanding. As a result, for example, homophonic letters, letters that sound alike but are written completely different, cannot be swapped in spelling, as it may create a completely different word. That is difficult, especially for Hebrew learners, when you're told that the letters taf and tet in modern Hebrew sound exactly alike. In ancient Hebrew and in certain Jewish communities, they're pronounced differently. In modern Hebrew, they're standardized as the same sound. However, you cannot swap them. You absolutely cannot swap them. It's not just a spelling mistake, it's a completely different word. For example, if you were to write Lamed Kaf Taf Vav Bet on the left-hand side here at the bottom, versus Lamed Chet Tet Vav Bet, even though you're taught when you're learning Hebrew that the letters Chaf and Chet sound similar and Taf and Tet sound similar, they're completely different words. They're even pronounced differently. The word on the left, lichtov, to write. The word on the right, lachtov, to chop wood. Okay, spelling is destiny. That can be difficult for people who have um, challenges like dyslexia, but the vast majority of us don't. That's a statistical fact. Therefore, need to keep it in your heads. You cannot swap letters out. Spelling has to be immaculate in the Hebrew language. And this is why, because it's so efficient in terms of plugging in a root into a form and vice versa, you create a word. Okay. With that, we're going to talk about the second part because I do know that binyanim are still taught at advanced levels. What is not taught is our next part. We've talked about this before, but it's important to go over again, okay? Which is a mishkal. If a binyan is for verbs, a mishkal is for nouns and adjectives solely. Mishkal literally means weight, just as binyan means a building, right? Think of building a building, all the different parts of it. Mishkal is weight. It's the weight we put on a word, or in this case, a root to create a word. Okay, Mishkal is the term we use for weight, W-E-I-G-H-T. It's also the form from the same root, shoresh, we get the word shekel, right? All these words are connected for a reason. Shekel being a form of currency back in the day was also a weight and measurement, just like all forms of currency. If you don't believe me, what do you call the form of currency in the United Kingdom? A pound. Okay, we're not just making this up, and certainly it's not just about Hebrew. We're special as Hebrew learners and speakers. We're not that special. Okay, Mishkal is weight, and it's the weight we put on a shoresh to create a noun and adjective. Okay, once again for review, all Hebrew nouns and adjectives have three components. And I put it as three here, but it's the same idea. A root, the Mishkal we're about to learn, and suffixes to denote gender and plurality. Okay, that's part of the Mishkal, by the way. Just like binyanim for verbs, just like what we did, mishkalim come with their own meanings. So we just went through the 7 binyanim, and I said some of them have a meaning of basic, some mean more intensive, some mean more causative, and one means reciprocal or reflexive. Same thing for mishkalim, except there are many, many, many more mishkalim that we use in everyday life. We just don't learn them as mishkalim. We simply learn them as words until you start recognizing, come back to the matrix, that there's a pattern. Something keeps repeating again and again, and it's that vowel pattern that keeps repeating that gets you to understand there's a connection between these words, and it isn't coincidental. In this case, we use the letters kuf, tet, lamed to indicate the consonants that you're going to plug in with the root. So for example, many place words in Hebrew have the mishkal miktala. You could think about it just right off your top of your head. How do you say a restaurant? Mis'ada, miktala. How do you say a healthcare clinic? Healthcare clinic in Hebrew. Mirpa'a, miktala, mis'ada. Predictable words that have the exact same vowel pattern and thus have the general meaning of a place. That vowel pattern indicates a place. In the case of a mis'ada, it's the place where you so'adim. You take that root that has to do with dining, right? Seuda is a festive meal. Mis'ada is a place where you have a festive meal or a meal, aka a restaurant. Mirpa'a is the place where you get refu'ah, health, healing, medicine. Okay, that's how predictable these are. Maktela is one of many ones that we have for a tool of some kind. The classic one that I know many of you learn if you're learning in an ulpan, certainly in the last few years here in Israel, is a mamtera. Or if you have small children or around small children, you've probably heard the song Many Mamtera, right? A mamtera is something that spreads matar. Matar, we've talked about before, means some sort of precipitation, i.e. water falling from the sky. A mamtera is a tool for creating matar, and mamtera is a sprinkler, a water sprinkler. And finally, another one, for example, we're going to look at a few more in just a second, is katil. Katil is often, not always, but often an adjective that is the equivalent in English of able or ible. Okay, so if I plug in certain roots into katil, I'm going to get something that corresponds into English as able or ible. Legible, edible, readable, predictable, questionable, um, all sorts of words like that, right? And as the bottom as it says, using context, we can determine the category of the word, and therefore it's Mishkal. Let's look at some examples before we move on to creating words, and especially new words. All right. Again, you'll get a copy of this. We've done this before, but we're going to add it, of course, to this. Here you have a spreadsheet with all sorts of different mishkalim. First off, one we've done a couple weeks ago, which is the verbal noun, the gerund, the ing, is considered a mishkal. In this case, we plug in the root and we create a verbal noun using that certain mishkal. The one I just talked to you about, right? Katil, which means able or ible in English. So for example, if I said, I saw this word over here, all the way over here, achil, okay? So if you look at this spreadsheet, excuse me, there we go, achil. I don't know what this word means. I can guess the vowel pattern is that because I know other words that may do that. And even if I don't, what other words do I know with the same shoresh, the same root, right? Right here on the left-hand side. I may know the word le'echol, to eat. I may know the word ochel, food. Achil means edible because I'm taking the root aleph chaf lamed that I already know has something to do with food and eating. I plug it into this mishkal, which I just learned from Jay, means able or ible in English, and I get the English word edible. What about, for example, zamin? We talked about zamin the other week. Zamin has the root zain mem nun, from which I also know words like zman, time, and lehazmin, to order or to invite, come from. Zamin means available, right? I have the time for something. We have all sorts of other ones here. All follow the same pattern. It's an adjective that then turns into the equivalent in English of able or ible, edible, reliable, flammable, reversible, available, likable, erasable, and so forth. Let's look at another mishkal. Maktela, we also talked about, right? Mamtera is over here, sprinkler, right? From the word matal, related to the word matal. What about, for example, a camera? How in the heck did modern Hebrew create the word camera? It took the mishkal maktela, the same one that means a tool or an instrument, that already has precedence in the modern Hebrew language. We put in the root tzadi lamed mem, which means tselem, image. We already have that term in biblical Hebrew, right? That all humanity is created b'tselem Elokim, in the image of God. Tsalam in modern Hebrew, by the way, means a photographer. Okay, so image, something that creates an image, is a matzlema. We plug that root that has to do with image into the mishkal. That means a tool or instrument for doing or creating that. And we get matzlema, photo camera. Okay, another one, maktela. Let's look at another one. Another one we just covered was miktala, right? Misada, where are you here? Well, I didn't even include it here because there are that many. But we did talk about a mirpa'ah, right? The place where you get refu'ah, or that you would meet a rofeh. You hear this, right? It's not just me. You're hearing the pattern of the same root, resh, pe, he, aleph, plugged into various mishkalim. Yes, the vowel pattern changes. Yes, there may be even other letters there, but that same sequence of resh, pe, aleph continues. So when it shows up again, I know other words that are related to it, and thus I can figure out this word. In this case, milpa'a. I can not only figure out how to pronounce it, but I can figure out what it means. For example, a midracha. A midracha is the place where you is a derech, a way, right? You may know the word already, derech, way, or you may have learned the word lidroch. Lidroch is one of the many words that we have in Hebrew of to walk or to move on your feet. In this case, a midracha is the tool, or in this case, excuse me, a place where you have a derech and where you can lidroch, sidewalk. All sorts of other ones here. Okay, miktala. Finally, one of my favorite mishkalim, because I think just this is creative as all heck, right? Katelet. The vast majority of diseases, old and new in modern Hebrew, are in the Mishkal Katelet. If you hear that a, e, et vowel pattern, chances are it's a disease. For example, nazelet. Many of you have nazelet right now. It's winter and stuff is going around. Nazelet is related to the word nozel, and with the root nun zayin lamed, which has to do with liquid. In this case, nozel is a liquid. Liquidy is also a way to think about it. Nazelet is a disease of something liquidy. In this case, a runny nose. What's another one that is great? Tsarevet. Don't eat the right things or you eat too much or something happens, you get tsarevet. What is tsarevet? It comes from the root tsadi, resh bet, and the verb related to it is litzrov, which is to sear, right? Often, if you go to a fancy restaurant here in Israel, it might list one of the parts of a meal as being tsaruv, seared, right? If something is searing as a disease, tsarevet, you have heartburn, right? Or how about sahevet? Sahevet, a great one, right? What is the word that you know in modern Hebrew that has the same root, sadi, he, bet? Sahov, the color yellow. What is the disease of the color yellow, or that includes the color yellow? Jaundice. It also happens to be the word in modern Hebrew for hepatitis, because again, hepatitis wasn't a word that you're going to find in the Tanakh, in the Bible, much less in the Talmud or anywhere else. Thousands of years ago, it may have existed, but it didn't have a word. But because we know that this, one of the symptoms of this, because it affects the liver, that's where the word hepatitis comes from in the Greek or Latin, affects your coloring because of bile, and bile is yellow, and jaundice, blah, 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 sahevet. Okay. We also get some other interesting words like sachevet and nayeret, the disease of dragging things out, or the disease of paper, i.e. paperwork and bureaucracy. Okay. Modern Hebrew is not just predictable, it's also creative and fun, right? So we take the mishkal that has to do with disease and we create modern diseases, quote unquote, like paperwork and bureaucracy, because hopefully none of you here like those things and think of them as something bad. Okay. Let's go back to our spreadsheet. Excuse me, our PowerPoint. Okay. So now that we've understand what a binyan looks like and how it works, and how a mishkal looks like and how it works, let's talk about when we talk about new words, because now we're talking about reverse engineering words. We see a word, how do we tear it apart? What are the different components of it? Let's talk about when I say not a new word. What doesn't constitute a quote unquote new word in Hebrew? In Hebrew, and we've talked about this before, a great way to create words in Hebrew is simply adding the suffix yud. Because in Hebrew, like other Semitic languages, we can immediately turn any noun into an adjective. In English, this would constitute a new word entirely, right? When we add suffixes like esk or ish or eyes or if I. How about the word commodify? I never learned the word commodify until I went to college. Who knew what commodify meant? But if you know what a commodity is, then you understand how the word is used. Commodify makes sense, to turn something into a commodity, right? Or the act of using something as a commodity. That isn't necessarily one. Hebrew, this isn't considered a new word, right? Because this is something that happens all the time. This isn't the same generating new words like it is in English and other languages. For example, America. America, usually when we're using that in Hebrew, only has to do with the United States. Sorry, not sorry, those of you from elsewhere in the Americas, usually only has to do with the United States. If I add ein yud at the end, Amerikai, I know it has to do with something American, specifically someone American. We've had a whole class about this before, so I'm only doing this as a review of what doesn't count, what we're talking about here. Just as if I added nun yod at the end of America, Americani, I know it's something American. Let's take something that doesn't have to do with places. Let's take the word shita. Shita in Hebrew is a system. Okay, system, S-Y-S-T-E-M. If I turn this into an adjective by changing that, by knowing the rules, and I change that hey into a taf and I add a yud, I get the word shitati. Shitati is an adjective, systematic, right? Just like how in English, I can add any of these suffixes to the end of a word and create it into usually a adjective. Sometimes it's also a verb or even a noun. So too in Hebrew, but this isn't what I'm talking about as new words, right? This isn't what we just talked about with Mishkalim. This is just simply turning any noun into an adjective. Hebrew, Arabic, all Semitic languages do this as well. What we're talking about is something different, right? How do we create new words? Because remember, we're celebrating Yom HaIvrit this week. How the heck in the turn of the 20th century did they take a 5,000-year-old language and create words like umbrella or jaundice, or all those other words you just saw, much less newspaper or balcony, words that didn't necessarily exist, but now we just assume have always existed, right? Because they're everyday things. First off, here are the rules for recognizing a new word. And this is true, by the way, any context clues you need for understanding any word in Hebrew. It's not necessarily a new word, it's any new word for you. Deep breath, go at your own pace. Find the words you definitely know around how to pronounce. They're your anchors, right? Don't take on a whole new sentence in one big bite. Find the words, maybe even dissect it with a pen or a pencil, and write down the words you do know. Okay? Move on to the words next to your anchors. Do they have any helper prefixes or suffixes? I show that at the end of this PowerPoint, so you have those. What's the root of the word? Can you figure out the root, even if you don't know the word at all? What's the root? Can you discern the form? Have you seen other words that look similar? And finally, sound out the words you don't know based on what you've learned and what it would sound like if a native Israeli were speaking. When in doubt, right? It's a joke, but it's absolutely true. When in doubt, if you're not being understood in Hebrew, all you got to do is say the word in another language with an Israeli accent. Works almost every time. Okay. Let's take an example. Okay, and I know we're running out of time, may not get to your questions, so this is also another prompt. If you have questions and you'd like me to answer them about this specific lesson, please write to us by email. Here are 3 words. Okay, all these 3 words are modern Hebrew. These words do not exist in Torah, certainly don't exist in Tanakh. Maybe one of them existed a couple hundred years ago. That's it. These 3 words did not exist. One of them didn't exist until 20 years ago, 25 years ago. One of them probably only about 125 years ago. Okay, 3 words. 2 of these are used all the time in modern Hebrew. All the time. In fact, I'm using one right now. I'm using 2 right now. Okay, how do I know these 2 words? These 3 words, excuse me. They all, first off, look at how they're written. What do you see that's similar with them? They all have the same first letter and same last letter, right? So already you're getting a sense there's a pattern here. I may not know the vowels that plug in, but I already see there's a pattern because I see the root. right? I see the letters that keep repeating on the ends, and most often in Hebrew, the suffixes and prefixes are there for a reason, that they are suffixes and prefixes. In this case, mem is a very common prefix for nouns and adjectives, and tet, taf at the end of the word also is. Okay. I discern the shoresh of each word, the three-letter root of each one. The first word, samech gimel resh. The second one, kuf lamed daled. And the third one, resh shin taf. Okay, I can figure that out. I figured out there's some pattern I don't know yet. I figured out the root, and now I can try to vocalize how this would sound. Thinking like an Israeli, how would I pronounce this that makes sense and that's easy to pronounce? In this case, the mishkal that's used to create a new word, in this case a noun, is miktelet. Miktelet. I-e-et. So you need that first mem, and you need that last taf as part of the mishkal, and the vowel pattern is I-e-e. Okay, so if I plug it in the first root, I get misgeret. Misgeret is a framework. Probably all of you have used or heard that word before. Framework of your child's education or your own education. A misgeret for a framework for doing anything in modern Israel. The next one I'm literally using right now. If I take the root kuf lamed daled into this form, miktelet, I get a mikledet. A mikledet is a keyboard, right? Laklid means to type. Klid and klidim are usually keys on some sort of instrument, like a piano. Okay, from that, I get the word mikledet. And then finally, and this one is an important one, resh shin taf. Resh shin taf. Resh shin taf only has one meaning in the Hebrew. It's not even one of these shorashim like we just did. Samech gimel resh has the general meaning of close. Okay, to close is lisgor. Okay, skira is closure. Segel is a lockdown. Right, you all may remember the segel from back during Corona days. Right, segel is close. Kuf lamed daled has something to do with a key being pressed to make some sort of motion. Reshin tav only has one meaning in Hebrew, reshet. Reshet is a net. Okay? From this word reshet, and you plug it into this root in the early 90s, we get the word milshetet. Guess what? You probably never heard the word milshetet before, and you probably will never hear it again outside of this class. Why? Milshetet means internet. You see it crossed out in Hebrew and English, and we're going to explain this is part of how we adopt new words. Yes, we can create a new word by plugging it into this Mishkal that happens to do with tools or instruments. But why didn't Milshetet catch? Why can't I just create anything I want in life, let alone in the Hebrew language? First off, milshetet is not the easiest or most aesthetically pleasing word to pronounce. It may not sound like it to you, but Hebrew is a very aesthetically pleasing, heavy language. It focuses a lot on making the language easy to pronounce and easy to hear. It's the reason why we have so many quote unquote exceptions that really aren't. And we have a whole class on that on YouTube. Okay. Unless quickly adopted by mavens and connectors, to use Malcolm Gladwell language, new things made abroad tend to keep their abroad name. When the Milshetet, when Ha-Milshetet came to Israel, not many people had a computer at home, let alone access to Ha-Milshetet, the internet. And thus it didn't catch on because not enough people were using that word on a regular basis. Internet worked because it was easy to pronounce. By the time it caught on in Israel, more people had it, and it was just understood worldwide as ha-internet. And finally, remember that as opposed to the first root and the second root that have other applications in Hebrew, reshet, reshin taf only means one thing. And so it's not understood, it's not heard, it's not used on a regular basis. That root we first started with, kaf taf bet, is used in dozens of words. There are other roots that have hundreds of applications. Reshet is only used for reshet. There's no other word that's commonly used in modern Hebrew with that root reshin taf, and therefore it's not widely known. So why plug it in and create a brand new word that we only associate with one thing? Reshet, a net, right? We use that word, by the way, now to mean net as a fishing net, a network. It can also be used for online. One word, instead of creating this new one, milshetet. So to sum up, what are the rules for creating a new word? How can I figure out misgeret or mikledet or milshetet? How can I create a word, for example, lefasbek? And I say the word to you and you know what that means. Lefasbek. By the way, what does lefasbek mean? To add someone on Facebook. Or if we go back a little farther in Israeli history, lefakses. If I said lefakses, many of you will know what that is. Hopefully enough of you don't know what that means because you don't need to use it anymore. To fax something. Lefakses, right? How do we create these new words? We're going to focus mainly on Hebrew, right? First off, it must be comprised of a root or a form, root and form. The root must be well known. It's used in everyday Hebrew, or it's something that's commonly used with a non-Hebrew origin. Lefasbek works because enough Israelis use Facebook. That makes sense in Israel. And more particularly, it's something that's commonly used with a non-Hebrew origin by teenagers. Western society is very much dictated by trends that teenagers create and use. Facebook, initially adopted by 20-somethings and then by teens, became a worldwide sensation. Now it's much more Snapchat and Instagram and TikTok for those who have it. The point, though, is you could really immediately understand it because it's something you commonly use. The form needs to be in either PL or hitpael, or commonly used Mishkal for nouns and adjectives. PL or hitpael is one of the most common, or two of the most common binyanim in Hebrew, and they're the most flexible. Listen to that sound, e. When you conjugate for PL, there's so many more vowel sounds that make adding and subtracting new letters much easier to pronounce and be heard. Same for hitpael, because the vowels a very similar pattern. That's for verbs. For mishkalim, it's a little different because we have so many of them. But you'll still see a lot of them follow those same mishkalim we just learned a little bit ago, right? Miktala, maktela, katil, a lot of those are used again and again. Spelling and pronunciation has to be kept as close to standardized modern Hebrew as possible. I'm going to just show you really quickly at the top in just a minute of appendix so you can see that, and I'll show you why we're showing you that. Newly coined words need to be easily pronounced and spelled. They need to be accessible. You can't get too esoteric here. I know you want to show off, but you have to make some language is used for communication. It's not meant to hide secrets, although language very much is wrapped up in mystery at the same time. But when we're talking about creating a new word, it's meant to be used. So people need to understand it more easily. And finally, bonus points for creativity. Puns or sounding like another word. A great example in modern Hebrew is a term that's come back in vogue, lehizdangif. Lehizdangif means to stroll up and down Dizengoff Street in Tel Aviv. Lehizdangif was at the time very subversive because the people who were walking up and down Dizengoff Street were teenagers and 20-somethings trying to be the vanguard of Israeli society. Lehizdangif sounds like another verb in Hebrew, which is not exactly a polite word. It's a four-letter word in Hebrew, right? But it's a play on that as well as the name of a popular street in Israel, in Tel Aviv. Creating those two together makes the perfect new word, lehizdangif. Okay. Finally, at the end, we have helper prefixes and suffixes. This helps you dissect Hebrew words to understand, are they new, are they not? Are the letters saying something to me? And loan words and transliteration. If you're trying to transliterate a non-Hebrew word like Facebook into Hebrew, what are the letters you need to use? Why am I putting this all on here? Number one, and here I'm going to stop. Number one, because it's important to understand how Hebrew works. Even if you're at a really beginner's level, even if your mind is that you just memorize words and you move on, you need to understand how Hebrew works. Because for some of you, this may be a game changer. To understand all Hebrew words have two components and that's it. And all I got to do, if I can't figure out the word's meaning, I can understand its two components separately and maybe from that dissect and divulge and discover other things. Okay, that's number one. And number two, because Hebrew is always evolving, it's creating new words, and we can have the power to create new words. So those of you who join us for Wednesday's Cafe Oleh conversations, please sign up now if you haven't already, because part of Wednesday's class is going to be creating a new word, sharing it in your group, and then having the group guess what the word means. And you're going to follow the rules I just gave you. I'm going to give you some more resources by email. So you're going to be able to create new words. If that's too complicated for you, or that's too advanced, do you think, you're also going to have the chance to share a quote unquote new word, a word that's only been around for a few years, and have your group guess what it means. Okay, so either way, we're going to celebrate Yom HaIvrit as the pioneers we are, not just in making Aliyah, but in using a very old language in very new circumstances. With that, we're at the top of the hour. Unfortunately, I don't have time for questions. So if you do have a question, again, hebrew@nbn.org.il. Next week's class, whether you join us for this Wednesday or not, is a great and important topic to redo, how to complain. Nicely, not so nicely, how to complain in Hebrew. With that, toda rabah. Thank you all so much. Yom HaIvrit Sameach. Have a happy Yom HaIvrit. Besorot tovot. May we only have good news. And lihitrot. See you all very soon. You will get a copy of all the spreadsheets, PowerPoint, and this recording in the next day or so. If not by email, then on youtube.com. Lihitrot. See you all very soon.